With no further ado, it's now my pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dr. GLORIA MACCOW, who's conducting our presentation today. GLORIA, you're on.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy, and welcome everybody. This is, I believe, the third webinar we've presented on PPVT-5 and EVT-3. If you haven't had the opportunity to attend the previous webinars, toward the end of this and also included in your handout, I have the URL where you can access the recordings of those previous webinars. Our focus today is going to be on interpretation of the data from the PPVT-5 and the EVT-3, and we will use a case study for that purpose. Before I begin with the content, I need to disclose some information. And first, it is that I am an employee of Pearson Clinical Assessment being the publisher of the PPVT-5 and the EVT-3, the two tools or assessments that will be the focus of this presentation. There is no relevant non-financial information to disclose. In terms of the outcomes, by the end of this session, we expect that you will be able to describe the relationship between vocabulary knowledge and crystallized ability, and I'll describe those two concepts. We also want to focus on the input, the processing, and the output demands of both of these assessments. And the reason that that is important is because the understanding of the demands of a task really can help us with the interpretation of the test results. Also, toward the end, we will analyze some case study data to identify appropriate interventions. In terms of the time-ordered agenda, we'll start out by looking at vocabulary knowledge and crystallized ability. That'll be followed by the demands of the PPVT-5 and EVT-3, and then we'll culminate with a case study where we hope to be able to connect assessment results to intervention, and then we'll leave about 5 minutes toward the end for questions and answers. But if you have questions as we're going through the presentation today, you can enter those questions into the chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. One of the things I want to say to get us started is that when you looked at the title of this presentation, it starts out with the names or the acronyms for two assessments, PPVT-5 and EVT-3. And definitely what we'll focus on today has to do with those assessments, has to do with those tools. But ultimately, as clinicians, as professionals who work with whether you're thinking about children or you're thinking about college-age individuals or you're thinking about adolescents or individuals in high school, the reality is that any assessment that we use is really used in the service of, in this case, a learner. So I want to start off by thinking about a learner and the typical learner for whom you might use a tool like the PPVT-5 or the EVT-3, or conceivably both. So ultimately what we want to try to understand is what the demands are for a certain functional environment. In this case, I'm going to be referring to a child we'll call Eva, who is 9 years old in grade 4. So as soon as I get that basic demographic information, I start thinking about the demands of that functional environment. And certainly I think about achievement, content areas. And what I know from what the teacher reports is that Eva's achievement in math is at grade level. I also know that her reading skills are below grade level, and additional information is that she started talking later than her siblings. I know that in grade 4, the way that some of these reading deficits might be manifested is in a weakness to learn new information in grade level textbooks. Now, I should tell you that by training, I am a school psychologist, and I worked for a number of years in schools. And I had the good fortune, and I do consider it a good fortune, to work with a number of children who resembled Eva in terms of the academic characteristics, the achievement or content areas. But one of the things that I learned in working as a school psychologist, and I realized this quite early on, was that many of the EVAs on my caseload were also on the caseload of my colleague, the speech-language pathologist. And it didn't take both of us long to realize that if we were to team up or to collaborate, that would be the most effective way to meet the needs of children like Eva. So when I get this information from the teacher, for example, my mind immediately goes to my area of focus, right, which is the cognitive ability. So when I look at this information, I think in terms of cognitive ability, it seems like Eva is capable of learning. Her achievement in math is at grade level. Similarly, I'm pretty sure when my colleague, the SLP, looks at these data, she might think she started talking later than her siblings. What was the impact in terms of receptive language, expressive language, and then how might that maybe later talking how might that have impacted her reading skills that the teacher reports to be below grade level, and that might in turn impact her ability to comprehend grade level textbooks. So even though our focus might be a little different, ultimately both professionals are really focused on collecting information that'll help us to help Eva function more effectively in her environment. So I always start thinking about what is that functional environment and what are the demands of that functional environment. When you're in grade 4, effectively, one of the things that we focus on with the typical grade 4 curriculum is the comprehension of text. Theoretically, all things being equal, the child has by then learned to read, so can recognize and name words fluently, and we now want the child to use reading to learn. So when you think about comprehending text, you think about comprehending text really as a complex skill. Loris Joseph, in her book, Understanding, Assessing, and Intervening on Reading Problems, talks about comprehending text as really requiring a number of component skills. The ability to understand text structure, when you think about morphology or grammar and syntax, the ability to make inferences, possibly using background knowledge or prior experiences when you're thinking about making inferences, knowing word meanings, vocabulary, absolutely vital to the comprehension of text or grade level text, and then really being able to make connections when you're thinking about relating sentences and paragraphs to each other. So when you think about comprehending text, it really is this complex skill that requires the child and adults as well to integrate all of these component skills and to do so effortlessly, right? That's really what we're focusing on. But when I think about comprehending text as a complex skill, I want to say a few more words about this one right here, which is the word meanings part. And of course, you could think about the reason for that. Part of the reason, of course, is that our focus today is on two assessments that focus on the assessment of word meanings. But the reason that that's important in the context of EVA is because there is this interconnection between vocabulary and comprehension. So when you think about reading vocabulary and reading vocabulary and reading comprehension, you think about how those two are related to receptive language and to expressive language. Virginia Berninger talks about the development of language and that we learn language first by ear and then by mouth. And I always think about that as the domain of the speech-language pathologist. And then when children enter school, we tend to build on that foundational knowledge, language by ear and language by mouth, receptive and expressive. And we want to introduce language by eye, which is the reading, and then language by hand, which is the writing. But the fact when children enter school, with a large vocabulary, that vocabulary really allows them to access basic reading skills where they use their vocabulary, they integrate that orthographic code with the phonological code, and then they often use the semantic code or their vocabulary to actually say the word, and then later, of course, to say the word in text. But when you think about comprehension in vocabulary, when children have a good vocabulary, that eases their transition into written text. But at the same time, children who engage in reading and writing really increase their vocabulary. So when you think about the relationship between comprehension and vocabulary, you see that reciprocal relationship. So when you think about it, certainly vocabulary determines how well an individual can read. But similarly, reading experience influences vocabulary development, right? So think about that interrelationship between vocabulary and comprehension, because when we think about Eva, that's one of the things that we want to consider. What is her level of word knowledge, and might that be one of the reasons that she's struggling to gain meaning from grade level text? So one of the things I want to think about now certainly is vocabulary knowledge. Virginia Berninger, Berninger, talks about the sequence of language development: language by ear, language by mouth, language by eye, and language by hand. Now, certainly when you think about vocabulary knowledge, and as a school psychologist, certainly I understood this early on, that vocabulary really has always been perceived as being related to cognitive ability, the ability to think and reason. Often we think with language. We think in words, right? So vocabulary knowledge and the ability to think and reason really are interrelated. And if you think about intelligence tests, probably starting way back in 1916 with the Stanford Binet, certainly you notice that most intelligence tests include some type of vocabulary subtest. And the reason for that, of course, is that vocabulary knowledge is indeed knowledge, and one of the best predictors of the rate at which a child will acquire new information is the rate at which he or she has acquired information in the past. So if I can assess the child's level of knowledge now, I can make a prediction about the rate at which the child is likely to continue to acquire information. So when you think about crystallized ability, I want to talk about vocabulary knowledge in relation to crystallized ability. So vocabulary knowledge first. So what is it really? Well, effectively, it's a form of achievement, right? So on many achievement tests, you would actually see measures of vocabulary. For example, receptive vocabulary or expressive vocabulary. And you might have tasks that measure word knowledge in isolation, looking at a single word. But you might also have components that measure vocabulary in context, right? So vocabulary is a really important part of achievement. And effectively what that represents would be the words and the word meanings that were learned through interaction with the environment. So I want to think about how children, or the sequence in which children learn vocabulary, and I want to show you some information that is going to be relevant to Eva. We're thinking about a child whose age is 7 years, and you're thinking about where we'd expect her to be in relation to vocabulary. Well, one of the things that you'd see here when you look at this information from Paul's book, Language Disorders from Infancy Through Adolescence, one of the things that we know is that children start learning the meaning of words in the home. However, there are so many words that they are introduced to only when they enter school. So between 7 and 9 years, we find that children are introduced to many new words that they may not up to that point have encountered in conversation. And one of the things that we know is that the word definitions tend to include synonyms, right? So if you think, for example, about maybe if I ask you, what does the word humongous mean? Well, you might actually use a synonym to demonstrate to me that you know the meaning of that word. You'd say, well, that word means large, and you might put it in a certain category. And one of the things that we learn quickly is that in the English language, several words have multiple meanings. Like if I tell you bark, and bark, well, how do you know which bark I'm referring to? Well, for that, you probably need some context. The other thing between the ages of 7 and 9 years is that the children's capacity for figurative language increases. So when you think about them being able to understand maybe metaphors and similes, for example, you notice that it's around that age from the transition from 2nd, 3rd to 4th grade where the focus on figurative language really increases. And then between 9 and 12 years, the vocabulary in school textbooks, and again, children are learning many words by reading, right? So they come to school having mastered a vocabulary that they were exposed to in the home, in different functional environments, but in school, they're introduced to many more words in writing, and those words tend to be more abstract and more specific than the words they use in conversation. We also expect them to acquire new information from written text. In fact, we expect them to continue to develop their vocabularies by reading. And then the other thing that's really important between the ages of 9 and 12 is the focus on idioms. So when you think about children being exposed to words with multiple meanings and the expectation that they will be able to understand most common idioms, certainly you think about the importance of assessing that when a child is struggling with the grade level demands or the grade level demands in 4th grade, in the 4th grade text, for example. So you want to think about the milestones, and as you are assessing a child's vocabulary, think about what the typical child that age is expected to do with respect to semantic development and assess the extent to which this child's language actually mirrors what these developmental expectations are. So I think the idioms is going to be important. We'll see that when we look at the case study for Eva. But before I get there, I want to say a few words in addition to what I said about vocabulary knowledge. I want to try to connect vocabulary knowledge and crystallized ability. Well, I think that we are clear that in order to demonstrate comprehension, in order to demonstrate knowledge, tests will actually measure the construct of knowledge, and what we use is information that children tend to acquire maybe in school or maybe in the home or maybe in other functional environments. So when you think about crystallized ability as described by the Cattell-Horn-Carroll model of cognitive abilities, CHC theory, crystallized ability really focuses on the person's knowledge base, general fund of information. Who discovered America? Who sailed the ocean blue? Those kinds of questions. What is the population of the United States? What is my general fund of information? But one of the things that I think is important is that crystallized ability, an important component of crystallized ability, truly is the lexical knowledge. And when you think about crystallized ability, it measures the general fund of information, but it also measures my store of acquired knowledge. So whether you think about general information, information about culture, lexical knowledge, or word meanings, all of that information theoretically is stored somewhere in my long-term memory, and on demand I am able to access that information in order to show you my acquired knowledge, my level of acquired knowledge. But one thing I want to point out here, when you look at crystallized ability here, and crystallized ability is really one of those unique broad abilities. It differs from some of the other broad abilities, like fluid intelligence, for example. It differs because not only does it include that store of acquired knowledge, it also includes a collection of processing abilities. And I want you to look at this. When you look at this collection of processing abilities, oral production and fluency, listening ability. What are these? Receptive language and expressive language. So if you think, for example, about me using a measure of vocabulary on a test of cognitive ability, I expect that the child is able to understand what I'm asking, to understand the directions. So receptive language is going to be important, or listening comprehension, if you will. And then for many of these tasks, the way that the child responds is by using expressive language. So when you think about crystallized ability, it goes to the storage and retrieval of information from long-term memory. It goes to certainly what do we want the child to be able to retrieve. It is that acquired knowledge. But we also think about those processing abilities that allow the child or the examinee to understand the task, to understand the question, and then to respond the way that the task was designed. So you notice that vocabulary is an important part of crystallized ability because it is part of the information that I have stored in my long-term memory. It's my lexical store, if you will. So all right. So I'll come back to some of these questions here toward the end. So let me make the connection now between crystallized ability and vocabulary and children with reading difficulties. So if you think, for example, about children who might be classified with a specific learning disability in reading, one of the things that we often want to take a look at is maybe trying to identify the specific cognitive difficulties that are associated with a reading disorder. And research has documented that vocabulary knowledge is directly linked to the development of reading skills. And so children who have a specific learning disability in reading may sometimes struggle with that semantic search and retrieval, going to that store or that lexical store, if you will, in order to retrieve the information. And some research has also found that when children struggle with reading, you might also find lower performance on expressive language measures and not always on receptive language measures. So you want to keep that information in mind when we start to take a look at the data from the case study. But one of the things that that researchers often do when they're developing different measures is they want to administer the tool to a number of children with specific clinical conditions, in this case SLD reading. What they want to try to do is to see what that group of individuals, I'll refer to that as the clinical mean, what their scores would be on specific tasks in relation to a matched control group. And typically the control group is matched on different demographic characteristics. And what you would expect theoretically is that the average score for the matched control group would be around the mean, would be around 100. So in this example here from the WISC-5, we find that on the Verbal Comprehension Index, which is a measure of crystallized ability, the mean for children with SLD reading was 89.1, the overall mean of 100, standard deviation 15. The mean for the control group was 100. When we look at the difference score, and I should tell you, I realized after we distributed the handout that I had some different numbers here. These are the correct numbers, so your handout will have different numbers, and I apologize for that. But what we want to look at here is to see if the difference between the performance of the clinical group and the control group, if that difference is significant statistically, and then we want to look at the magnitude of the difference. So when you look at the p-value, that difference of 11.63 is significant statistically, at least at the 0.01 level, and the difference is large when you think about the effect size. Any standard difference score, Cohen's D of 0.8 or higher would indicate that the difference is large. Similarly, when you look at similarities, you notice that the difference is significant, and again, the effect size is large. For vocabulary and information, between 0.5 and 0.7, that would be a moderate difference, so these differences here would be moderate. So definitely when you think about crystallized ability, you'll notice that children with SLD reading will score lower on the Verbal Comprehension Index compared to a matched control group. When we look at similar data from the PPVT and the EVT, you'll see a similar pattern. So when you think about receptive vocabulary, PPVT-5, again notice the clinical mean of 90 for a group of children diagnosed with LD reading and or writing, LD in reading and or writing. Again, notice that the mean for the matched control group right around 100, and the difference is significant statistically, and the size of that difference is large. For EVT-3, again notice the difference is significant statistically, and the effect size is large. So you'd expect theoretically that children who are classified with a specific learning disability in reading and or writing would also score lower on measures of vocabulary. So one of the things that I always think about when I think about working with children is really that the focus of the work I'm doing is in an effort to understand what the demands are of that functional environment, to identify what the child brings in terms of the characteristics needed to meet those demands, and more importantly, what the child is going to need in order to meet the demands of that functional environment. So one of the things that I like to take a look at is the demands of the tasks, because once I get the child's scores, I can start thinking and I could start integrating some of my behavioral observations in an effort to try to understand why the child might have earned a relatively low score on whatever it is that I am measuring. So I took a look at the demands, and I always think about the input demand. So when the task is presented, what is required from the child in order to understand the directions and in order to understand the target word. So auditory perception is important when you think about both PPVT-5 and EVT-3. So we're going to present the instructions verbally. We expect the child to understand the words that we're using. And then for PPVT-5, we are going to present a target word. And we expect the child to be able to make sense of the word that he or she is hearing. Auditory discrimination is probably important as well, but auditory perception really looks at are you able to assign meaning to what you're hearing. Now, when you think about the EVT-3 in terms of input, we certainly expect the child to be able to understand the directions, but the items, we expect the child also to be able to understand the instructions for each of the items. But for both of these tests, there is a pictorial component, right? So in addition to the auditory perception, visual perception is important. You should be able to make sense of the pictures that you're seeing in order to be able to identify the picture that depicts the target word on the PPVT-5, for example. So there is this auditory and visual component, and certainly when you think, for example, of the PPVT-5, you see that we are simultaneously focusing the child's attention on what we're saying and what he or she is seeing. Now, when you think about the output demands of these tests, certainly for the PPVT-5, it was designed, the output was conceptualized as a simple motor response. So when you think about the child, most of the instructions we give either show me or point to, but a simple motor response is what is typically required. But because we understand that some children may not be able to respond using that motor, we also provide the opportunity for the child to tell us the number of that item that they're choosing. So verbal expression is an option, but the output for PPVT-5 definitely is that simple motor, versus the output for EVT-3 that requires verbal expression. Now, when you think about the processing, what is happening in the brain between the input and the output, certainly what we expect the child to do is to understand the information and then to use his or her knowledge of word meanings in order to choose the correct picture from the four pictures that we present as options, one being the correct picture to associate with the target word, and three being distractors. When you think about EVT-3, certainly acquired knowledge, and both of these are measuring acquired knowledge. But when you think about the acquired knowledge on EVT-3, certainly you think about language development, you think about morphology and syntax in addition to semantics or word knowledge. But the important thing for EVT-3 that is different from PPVT-5 is that in order to respond, the child must search his or her long-term memory and retrieve information from long-term memory, and must do so quickly. Because effectively, what I want the child to do is to tell me the right word, but to tell me that right word within 10 seconds. So you expect the child to be able to fluently retrieve the information from long-term storage. The reason I think this is important is because there may be children who might struggle because of a weakness in acquired knowledge. It might be that some children are struggling because they can't retrieve the information from long-term memory, or it might be that they're struggling because of the output demand, right? Whether it's verbal expression or it's that simple motor response. Now, we have the option here on PPVT, if the child struggles with the motor, for the child to respond verbally, but on EVT-3, we do have that verbal expressive demand, so a child who struggles with verbal expression might score low on this task, not because of word knowledge, but because of the output demand of the task. So when we take all of that information into consideration, I want us to take a look at some actual data and think about the demands of the tasks, think about the importance of vocabulary, its relation to crystallized ability, and think about the data that will generate for Eva, and then also what we can do to help her as she makes her way in that fourth grade classroom. So this is Eva that I introduced at the beginning. I mentioned that she struggles with grade level text. She's doing okay in math. So her teacher decided, based on Eva's performance in the classroom, that she would refer Eva for comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation. And what the teacher really wanted to know was to what extent maybe reading difficulties or below grade level reading skills affected Eva's ability to learn new information from her grade level textbooks. So use reading to learn, if you will. So we started out by trying to confirm what the teacher had told us about Eva's academic achievement, and in fact we were able to verify that her achievement in calculation and problem solving indeed are at grade level, and that she is struggling with language arts. Her scores were below grade level in basic reading, word recognition, and reading decoding. Those are accuracy kinds of tasks, but also below grade level in oral reading fluency, where you're thinking about being able to name words effortlessly, right? So she struggles with that piece. Her performance or achievement was also significantly below grade level in spelling. And again, as a speech-language pathologist or as a school psychologist, we all understand that when you think about word decoding and spelling, for example, that phonological, that word that hopefully is part of the speaking vocabulary, that is really helpful when you are trying to name words with highly predictable patterns, word decoding, or if you are writing words, especially if they have highly predictable patterns. So the ability to connect what you see and what you say is really important when you think about word decoding and spelling. So it's not unusual. As a matter of fact, it's very common for a child to score at about the same level on word decoding and spelling because of the demand to connect the orthographic, the visual, with the phonological or the verbal. But one of the things that we notice here was that if you struggle to name words, that's going to impact your comprehension. If you struggle to name words, you're constantly decoding words, so you read at a slow pace, that's going to adversely impact reading comprehension, which we saw here. At the same time, what we noticed with Eva is that when we provided her with text that she could decode, so when we reduced the readability level of the words in text, she was able to respond appropriately to questions, especially questions that measured literal comprehension. All of the incorrect responses that we noted on reading comprehension were for items that assessed inferential comprehension. So I want you to keep that in mind because I think that that's going to go back to the language. But the question that we ask, what do we know about Eva in terms of her academic achievement, especially related to reading? Well, what we know is that there is a gap in her skill and the skills of the typical child in the 4th grade. The question that we want to ask and answer with our data is why? Well, we know that basic reading certainly impacts comprehension, but we also know that there are other factors, an important one of which is vocabulary, and another one is that overall crystallized ability or verbal comprehension. So we decided that we would proceed with an assessment of her overall verbal comprehension abilities, and so the school psychologist was responsible for that piece. And what we found was that her verbal comprehension index of 76 indicated that she was struggling to provide the definitions of words, to use words to reason, to identify similarities between words, to put words into categories, all of which are important when we looked at that semantic development for children who are about 9 years old. So she certainly struggled with that. Now, here's the thing about verbal comprehension and about probably anything that we assess. There are always a multitude of reasons why a child's score might be low. And one of the things that we do when we're conducting assessments is we really provide this detective function, right? So we're trying to understand why the child is struggling, why the child earned that particular low score. So if I think about low verbal comprehension, well, it's measuring one of the tasks there, vocabulary, is a direct measure of word knowledge. Similarities is using your knowledge of words to think and reason and see relationships between words. So poorly developed word knowledge definitely could explain that relatively low score. However, I also know, based on the output demand, that it is possible that she struggled to retrieve acquired information from long-term memory. Maybe that information is in her long-term store, but for whatever reason, she wasn't able to retrieve it. I also know that the subtests that make up the Verbal Comprehension Index have an expressive demand at the output phase, and I know that it is possible that that could conceivably explain that relatively low score. Another possible explanation is that she struggles with reasoning and problem solving. Now, there are some ways for us to tease out some of these, and one way that I was able to remove this one effectively as a possible hypothesis for this relatively low score is that when I compare her score on verbal comprehension to her score on fluid reasoning, I noticed that she was able to reason effectively using the tasks on the fluid reasoning index. So I am going to rule out this one as a possible explanation for that low score. And then I want to maybe proceed to evaluate these three a little further, right? And so what we did is, this is when we decided to collaborate with our colleague, the speech-language pathologist, who was able to provide us with additional information on Eva's vocabulary, both receptive and expressive. And when you look at her scores here, PPVT-5, notice her standard score of 101, again, mean of 100, standard deviation 15. And then for the EVT, notice her standard score of 80. So the question that you ask is the difference between those two scores, the 21-point difference, is that difference significant, and is that difference unusual? And notice that the difference of 21 points exceeds the critical value at the 0.05 level, which means that that difference is significant statistically, and the percent of normative population with that difference will tell you whether or not that difference is unusual or rare. And you'll notice that in our normative population, less than 5% of individuals that age actually had a difference of that magnitude in that direction. So this 21-point difference is significant statistically. It's highly unusual, which means that we must consider it clinically significant, and we must incorporate it when we think about recommendations for treatment. So definitely in the both the PPVT-5 manual and the EVT-3 manual, we have a number of possible reasons for, a number of possible explanations for the 21-point difference in favor of receptive or PPVT-5. Certainly if you think about the input, output, and processing demands of PPVT-5, where I'm going to present 4 pictures, I'm going to use a target word that's associated with one of the pictures. A child who is good at using partial knowledge might be able to rule out distractors in order to pick the correct response. So that it could be a possible explanation for that receptive higher than expressive score. I also talked about on the EVT-3, certainly you need the child to be able to retrieve one word associated with a stimulus. You need the child to retrieve that word from long-term memory and to do so quickly within 10 seconds. So some children may score higher on receptive because of that processing demand that is specific to the EVT-3. That's another possible explanation. Now, we already had some indications from the from the Crystallized ability assessment that we might be concerned about retrieval difficulties, ability to retrieve information from long-term storage. So I'm going to keep that in the back of my mind. Also, when I think about the output demand of the EVT-3, certainly the output demand is expressive. So children who are reluctant to speak may score better on the PPVT-5 that requires that pointing response. And then the fourth hypothesis could be children who have a broad experiential background. They may know different labels for the same object or for the same action, and they may have a better chance of recognizing the single word that is used as the stimulus in PPVT. So effectively, you think about all of the possible explanations for the pattern of scores that you see, and then what you try to do is to think through which of those patterns might in fact make sense. So one of the things that you can also take a look at when you get the information from the PPVT-5 and EVT-3 is you can compare the child's vocabulary that is typically learned and used in the home versus vocabulary that is typically associated with a school. And what you see here for Eva is that she performed comparably on the vocabulary words, whether the receptive or the expressive, although you look here at the home words for EVT-3, very few words, so we want to keep that in mind as well. But certainly it seems as if she has learned the words that are typically associated with the home. Compared to the school, you notice percent correct, 88% for PPVT-5 and 71% for EVT-3. So again, you're thinking about what we talked about earlier with respect to those semantic developmental milestones when you think about what happens in the school with respect to idioms and figurative language and those kinds of words. And you can also look at her performance with respect to the three-tier model of vocabulary. And certainly tier 1 words are the words that we typically learn at home. And you notice again percent correct 100. Whereas when you look at the tier 2 words, you notice, and those are words certainly used by mature language users across different content areas, you notice that her percentage correct is a little lower. So we have some explanations about possibly why she's struggling with a grade level curriculum, certainly vocabulary, especially expressive vocabulary. From crystallized ability, from reading comprehension, we have indications that maybe making inferences might be an issue. So one of the things that we wanted to take a closer look at was her ability to make inferences. And again, the speech-language pathologist suggested that we assess the ability to make inferences closer using this particular task here. So one of the things that we wanted to compare was when you think about her ability to use content and context to make appropriate inferences, especially initiating conversations, the meta-pragmatics index, and we wanted to compare that to her ability to respond to tasks that required her to process and understand sentences with multiple meanings, which we talked about earlier, and also to understand abstract idiomatic expressions measured by the meta-semantics index. And when you look at her scores, notice that her scores for meta-pragmatics are within the average range, a standard score of 93, again, 100 being the mean, standard deviation being 15. And on the subtest, making inferences and conversational skills, standard score, well, her score there is a 9, the mean for that one being 10. But when you look at the meta-semantics index, notice her score corresponds to the 4th percentile rank. So definitely when you look at a task that assessed multiple meanings, where you expected her to interpret different meanings, looking at word level and sentence level ambiguities, you see her score better than the scores of approximately 9% of others her age. And when you look at her performance on figurative language, where you're thinking about idioms, notice her performance better than that of approximately 2% of others her age. So again, you'll take all of these data. We will analyze our data in order to identify her strengths in relation to the demands of that classroom environment. And one of the things that we will conclude in summary is that in terms of the expectations in that classroom, the 4th grade classroom, where she's expected to use words with multiple meanings, idioms, and figurative language, you notice that she has yet to master those metalinguistic skills that are necessary for her to be competent when you think about the requirements of that 4th grade classroom, especially as the tasks become more inferential in nature. So again, the metalinguistic skills that are necessary for communicative competence have yet to be developed. And then if you think about idiomatic language, we identified that as a weakness, and we also identified inferential comprehension as a weakness. So again, we'll have to think about how we will proceed in terms of interventions and treatment in order to allow her to function more effectively in that environment. And then certainly we don't want to ignore the fact that reading comprehension, understanding grade level text requires basic reading skills, which also are a weakness for her. So what are some of the things that we want to focus on? Well, we want to focus on the things that we know will improve her ability to function in that environment. So meta-semantic language, for example, what are some things that we can do? Provide explicit teaching using meta-semantic tasks like resolving lexical and structural ambiguities, recognizing non-literal language. We certainly want to focus on improving basic reading skills, but we definitely understand that the typical 4th grade curriculum has moved away from explicit instruction in basic reading skills, and so we want to recognize that the 4th grade is focusing on text level instruction, and how can we integrate word level instruction with text level instruction in order to make sure that we help her to move forward with respect to the demands of the grade 4 curriculum. And then also you think about her word knowledge, right? We want to make sure that we're able to improve her depth of word knowledge, her understanding of concepts. So we want to maybe provide activities that focus on synonyms, antonyms, related words. So for example, if you think about a word like hot, what are some related words like scorching or humid or tepid or red hot or lukewarm, those kinds of words, thinking about what we can do to enrich her word knowledge, especially focusing on depth of word knowledge. And then, of course, we want to think about the important component, which is the retrieval of information. Well, retrieval of information really is facilitated when I store the information in a place where I can access it later. So we want to start working with her on strategies that will allow her to store the information in long-term memory. So maybe presenting the information using different sensory channels, saying and seeing and writing. So using different sensory methodologies in order to register the information. Helping her to create some mnemonics. For example, my dear Aunt Sally, when you think about the operations in math. And then important is that background knowledge, right? Being able to connect new information to previous learning. And once we focus on the storage at the same time, we also want to focus on retrieval of information. A really good strategy to facilitate retrieval of information is to use a strategy that I'm going to call here cueing recall. So for example, if I ask an open-ended question in my classroom, then I expect the child to understand the question, to search long-term memory, and retrieve the words, and then put those words together to give me the answer. However, if when I am asking the question, I provide 2 or 3 options, in fact, what I'm doing is cueing her recall. One of the things that I didn't mention about Eva is that she seems to be much less engaged in the classroom than her peers. And my hypothesis is that it is because when you think about open-ended questions, she really is struggling to retrieve the answer from long-term storage. And by the time she gets the answer, more than likely one of her peers has already responded. Whereas if we can present multiple options, that will allow her to formulate a response quickly, and also the verbal expressive demand is going to be reduced. And then gradually as her participation increases, we might be able to replace some of these cued recall kinds of questions with more open-ended questions. Okay. All right. So one of the things I included here for you, and these aren't related to Eva, just some information that you will be able to generate if you are using Q Global, some suggested interventions like cooperative learning, peer tutoring, robust vocabulary instruction, certainly semantic mapping, and so on. And then, of course, we want to think about some of the strategies that you use when you think about vocabulary. And certainly the work of Judy Montgomery can help us to think through some of those strategies. So for example, the 4 word types, when you think about vocabulary in terms of listening vocabulary and speaking vocabulary and reading and writing. And then tier 2 words, I think the words that are used by mature users. Repetition, where it is true that some children are able to fast map, but most children really require repetition in order to learn the meaning of words. And then the dense neighborhoods, think about presenting words like what I showed you when I showed you hot. Present words as part of a dense neighborhood. How are they similar phonologically? Hot and pot and spot and so on. And how are they similar semantically? How are they similar in terms of usage? So I think these evidence-based vocabulary strategies might be helpful for you as you think about implementing programs to improve children's vocabulary. So I think what we try to do here today is to describe the relationship between vocabulary knowledge and crystallized ability, to think about the demands of the task. When you're administering a test, what are the task demands? And then to use the case study data to link to appropriate interventions. So I noticed there were a number of questions that are coming through. Let me see if I could take a look at some of those. How does GC compare to theory of mind? So theory of mind really, if you think about it in terms of language, refers primarily to the pragmatics of language, whereas crystallized ability looks primarily at acquired knowledge. So theory of mind, children who might have a disorder on the autism spectrum, for example, often will score low on measures of theory of mind, but really has to do with the pragmatics of language, how you use language in social situations. Okay, let's see. Is Eva from a bilingual home? The answer is yes, except that she has always heard English at home and has always spoken English at home. But certainly that is something that we'll want to take into consideration as well when we think about analyzing our scores. So thank you for asking that question. Okay. Okay. So somebody says, Henriette, in higher grades, this might be an issue, isn't it? Math, in a way, is language-based. That is correct. So one of the things that's really important, and that's one of the reasons perhaps that we want to make sure that we can provide her with accommodations if she needs to, because in fourth grade, just like reading focuses primarily on comprehension, math focuses primarily on problem solving. However, one of the things, again, that I take into consideration when I evaluate the data is what were the input demands of that problem-solving subtest that I administered. And certainly she heard the question and she was reading along as well. So she received the information both verbally as well as visually. And so she was able to use the computation in order to provide the correct response. However, for example, if she's taking an end-of-year test where she has to read the math problem solving, we may want to consider reading aloud for her because, of course, the reading weakness will adversely impact her performance in math, which we don't want. We don't want that reading weakness to be a confounding variable when you think about math. Okay. The top slide of page 8, why is thank you for asking that question. Why is PPVT-5 better? That's probably not worded appropriately. I think I was talking about this slide right here, Eva's score. Her score on the PPVT-5 is better than her score on the EVT-3. That's what I was referring to here. So possible reasons for why the score on PPVT-5 is higher, or effectively possible reasons for why her recognition vocabulary is higher than her production vocabulary. That's what I was referring to there. I will change that. It's probably a little confusing.
Next session.